Thank you for joining me again. This is Thomas Kissinger, and this is going to be If God Could Save Everyone, Would He? And this is going to be part 8 in the series. We're going to pick up where we left off, reading through this booklet by Dr. Stephen Jones, explaining this great subject. And last time when we left off, we had gone through the section entitled, Death is the Penalty for Sin. Picking up in the middle of that section, there is no way, of course, that any man will be able to actually pay the penalty for his own sins. For this reason, they will also be sold into bondage according to the law, Exodus 22:3. They will be put under the authority of the believers, the servants of Christ, in order that they may serve their sentence until the Jubilee sets all men free. In the final analysis, the law says that if a man cannot pay a debt which is incurred by sin, he is to work as a bondservant to pay the debt. If the debt is too great to be paid, he must work until the year of Jubilee sets him free. The unbelievers at the great white throne will be sentenced to work as bondservants until the final Jubilee sets them free. The purpose of this is not so that their masters can act like tyrants over a bunch of slaves. In other words, the purpose of putting bondservants under masters is so that the sinners of the earth may learn the will of God and learn to follow Christ. Their masters will teach them and train them in the laws of God. What a happy time! For this reason, Psalm 130 verse 4 says, "There is forgiveness with thee, God, in order that you may be respected." We respect those who have the ability to forgive, not those who perpetually refuse to forgive others. God has often been presented as one who will either not or cannot forgive sin. Once a man has completed his life on earth, so it is no wonder so many have no respect for God. Let's read that again. God has often been presented as one who either will not or cannot forgive sin. Once a man has completed his life on earth, it is no wonder so many have no respect for God. I believe that God has been misrepresented. And that's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. God has been misrepresented by modern day evangelical Christianity when they preach all their sermons proclaiming that God will torture people forever or that God will annihilate people into extinction forever. Both of those two camps do not understand the law of God. They do not understand the judgment of God. They do not understand the second death. They do not understand the lake of fire. They do not understand the very character and nature of God, which is to purify and to correct. Let's go on now into the second death. The sentence of the law upon the unbelievers is in itself the second death. The second death is not like the first death. The first death is mortality that ends with men being placed in a grave. The second death comes at a time when the first death itself is destroyed, as we read in Revelation 20:14. And death and Hades, the grave, were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. He was telling the people that to violate God's laws was the way of death. Ultimately, he was speaking of the second death that is mentioned in Revelation 20:14. There, the second death is equated with the lake of fire. This death is different from the first kind of death, mortality and literal death, because in that day, death itself will be destroyed. Men will no longer die after they have been raised from the dead, but they will have to remain separated from God until the great Jubilee. Because of Adam's sin, all men have become mortal. That in itself is a judgment for sin. But the final judgment is the lake of fire, which is the second death, Revelation 20:14. This type of death is of a different sort. It speaks of the future age when the unbelievers who do not avail themselves of Jesus' offer of redemption will remain mortal and will have to learn right and wrong as servants of God. They will not die, but will remain as servants of God, learning the ways of God in much the same manner as believers today are learning obedience. That age may last for thousands of years, with everyone experiencing a sort of immortality. Our bodies are designed to last forever, with old cells being replaced by new cells, so long as we have the proper nutrition and environment. This will be an age in which all men will experience that bodily renewal, and if anyone should happen to die by some accident, they could easily be raised from the dead immediately. During this time that God rules the earth through Jesus Christ and the sons of God, the nations will rejoice. Finally, there will be true justice and mercy in the courts. Psalm 67:4 says, "Oh, let the nations be glad and sing for joy, for you will judge the nations upon earth." Psalm 72:11 says, "Yes, all kings shall bow down before him, all nations shall serve him." Psalm 86:9 and 10 says, "All nations that you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and they shall glorify your name. For you are great and do wondrous deeds. You alone are God." The final outcome of God's will. In Genesis 9 through 17, God made a covenant or contract with the whole earth. It was a covenant that said he would never again destroy the earth. Many today mistakenly think that the earth is soon going to be destroyed either by men or by God. This is not true. It may look like disaster is coming, and it is certain that man would destroy the earth if it were left to him. But God has promised to prevent it. This is the first covenant that God made with anyone. The first time that the word covenant is used in the Bible is found here in Genesis 9:9. At earlier times, God made promises, not covenants. Years later, in the story of how God brought Israel out of Egypt, we find that the Israelites were rather stubborn and disobedient to God, and they came near to stoning Moses more than once. Finally, after 10 examples of direct disobedience, God told Moses in Numbers 14:12, "I'm just going to destroy the whole nation and start over with you and your children." This was, of course, just a test, for God knew that he would not do this. So did Moses. That is why Moses reminded God of his promise to Israel. He also said in Numbers 14:15 and 16 that if he were to destroy the people, it would be admitting that he was not powerful enough to do what he had said he would do. The people of the other nations would say that it was because God was not able to bring this people into the land which he promised them by oath. Here is the crux of the matter. Was God really able to fulfill his intent? Could his will be thwarted by man's will? Is man's free will more powerful than God's sovereign will? Nowadays, many people would say that God could not be blamed for the refusal of the people to be obedient to him. But that is not the issue. The fact is, if God were unable to make Israel obedient, then God would be perceived as a failure. It is much like a disobedient child. If the parent is unable to turn the child into a productive citizen, then it is ultimately the failure of the parent, not of the child. The child is not the one in authority. Whoever is in the position of authority is responsible for those under him or her. So God tempted Moses to see if he would take the bait. But Moses had no such ambitions to make his own family the chosen people. Moses then challenged God in an extraordinary manner, telling him that the nations would think God is not able to perform his will, that man's will was stronger than God's will. God's response was to tell Moses in Numbers 14:21, "But indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord." Not only was God able to bring this one nation into the land God had promised, but he was also able to fill the whole earth with his glory. In other words, man may temporarily remain in bondage as a slave to sin and outside of his will. But ultimately, God's will is that the whole earth would be filled with his glory. God's will is to save all men. 1 Timothy 2:4. There is nothing and no one on earth that can prevent this from taking place. Either men will consent to be redeemed in this age, or they will do so after the final judgment at the great white throne. So we have to see that man is able to temporarily go against the will of God. But God has designed a plan that ultimately man cannot go against. Man can ultimately not go against the plan of God. And the plan of God and God's desire is that all will be saved and to come unto the knowledge of the truth. Now, modern day Christianity as a whole will teach against this and say that no, God has to bend the knee to man's will, and that man's will is more powerful than the blood of the cross of Jesus Christ. But I tell you, no way. No way, because Jesus said that if he was lifted up from the earth, died on the cross, that he would drag all people unto himself. And yes, that is God's plan, and his plan is so magnificent that he is going to include everyone and has included everyone. And in the end, all will come unto him, because that's our God. That's our Heavenly Father. He's the Father that awaits for every prodigal son to come home. And God's going to have his way, because his plan is for all of the earth to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And his plan is for every knee to bow and every tongue to confess Jesus Christ is Lord. He swore it, and Isaiah said it. God said, I swear that every knee will bow to me and every tongue will confess. Because God is a good God, and God will have all to be saved and to come unto the knowledge of the truth.